my breath hitched in my throat. I was just standing there, frozen, staring at the huge bronze man. The air was thick with the smell of old metal and something else. Something electric, like the air after a lightning strike. The silence that followed the grinding noise was worse than the sound itself. It was a listening silence, a waiting silence. I finally managed to tear my eyes away from the statue. I scrambled backwards, stumbling over my own feet. I didn't stop until my back hit a cold marble column. I slid down to the floor, my legs too weak to hold me up anymore. My flashlight lay on the floor beside me, its beam pointing up at the dark ceiling like a pale, trembling finger. My mind was a whirlwind of pure panic. This wasn't possible. These were things you read about in scary stories online, not things that happened in real life. Not to a guy named Leo who just wanted a quiet night job to pay his rent. I fumbled in my pocket for the note. My fingers were numb, clumsy. I pulled it out and smoothed the wrinkled paper on my knee. I read it again, my eyes jumping from one rule to the next. Keep your eyes on the weeping Marquis, the bronze soldier. Whisper, the war is over. You will hear whispers, do not answer them. A child crying, it is a lure. Leave him a small, polished stone. This crumpled piece of paper was now the most important thing in my world. It was a survival guide. Arthur wasn't hazing me. He was trying to save me. How many guards before me didn't listen? How many thought it was a joke? A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. I had to get up. I had to finish my patrol. Hiding here wasn't an option. What if another rule had a time limit I didn't know about? What if staying still was the most dangerous thing I could do? Slowly, using the pillar for support, I pulled myself back to my feet. My knees felt like jelly. I picked up my flashlight, the metal cool against my sweaty palm. I had a route to follow, a path laid out on a map in the security office. The next section was the second floor, the West Wing. That meant passing through the Baroque gallery. My heart sank. The Weeping Marquis. Rule number 1. At all times, keep your eyes on the Weeping Marquis in the Baroque gallery. Never, under any circumstances, turn your back on it. I took a deep, shuddering breath and forced myself to walk. I left the grand hall, glancing back one last time at the bronze soldier. He was perfectly still, a silent giant guarding the darkness. But now I knew his secret. He was a piece of a larger, terrifying puzzle. The journey to the second floor felt like a mile-long walk into a nightmare. The grand staircase was a spiral of dark, polished wood that creaked under my weight. Each step groaned, announcing my presence to the entire museum. The paintings on the walls seemed to watch me pass. The eyes of stern-faced dukes and pale, smiling women followed my light. Before tonight, they were just paint on canvas. Now, I wasn't so sure. Was anything in this building just what it seemed? I reached the second floor landing. A large, arched doorway led into the Baroque gallery. The air flowing out of it was colder than the rest of the museum. It was a damp, heavy cold, like a cellar. It smelled faintly of rain and wet stone. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, my flashlight beam cutting into the darkness of the gallery. The room was filled with elaborate furniture, gilded mirrors, and, in the very center, the Weeping Marquis. The statue was carved from a single piece of white marble. It was a masterpiece, horribly beautiful. The woman stood with her head bowed, her face hidden in her hands. Her marble dress seemed to flow around her like water. Her shoulders were slumped in an attitude of eternal sorrow. The beam of my flashlight made the white stone almost glow. It looked like a ghost, I remembered the rule. Never turn your back on it. Okay, I could do this. I just had to walk through the room, check the emergency exits on the other side, and walk back out, all while facing the statue. It sounded simple enough, but my feet felt nailed to the floor. I forced myself to take the first step into the room. The echo of my footstep was swallowed by the thick silence. The statue stood there, unmoving, just a piece of stone, a very creepy, very lifelike piece of stone. I walked slowly along the edge of the room, my head turned stiffly to keep the statue in my sight. My neck was already starting to ache. My flashlight was fixed on it. The light slid over the smooth curves of the marble, the intricate folds of the dress, the delicate fingers pressed to its unseen face. I reached the far wall and checked the emergency exit. The bar was in place. The alarm was active. Everything looked normal. Now for the hard part. I had to walk back to the entrance. I started shuffling sideways, then backwards, my eyes glued to the white figure in the center of the room. It was unnerving. I felt like I was in a staring contest with something that had no eyes. The statue just stood there, weeping into its hands. Or was it? I stopped. A prickle of doubt, cold and sharp, went through me. Had its hands always been covering its entire face? I felt like before, I could see a hint of its marble hair peeking through its fingers. But now, they seemed pressed tighter, more desperate. I told myself I was imagining things. My mind was playing tricks on me, spooked by the bronze soldier and the creepy note. Of course, it hadn't moved. It was a statue. But I started walking backwards faster. The sound of my own breathing was loud and harsh in my ears. I kept my flashlight beam locked on its hands. Just watch the hands, I told myself. If they move, you'll see it. The silence in the room seemed to press in on me. It felt like the air was holding its breath. Then I heard it. It was so quiet I thought I had imagined it. A soft, wet sound. A choked little gasp of grief. It sounded like it came from right in front of me. My blood turned to ice water. I froze, my feet stuck to the floor. The sound had come from the statue. I stared, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. The marble figure was perfectly still, unchanged. Had I really heard it? Was I going crazy? And then I saw it. Something was different. On the polished marble floor, right at the base of the statue, was a small, dark spot. A wet spot. It was about the size of a coin. As I watched, another tiny drop fell from between the statue's marble fingers and hit the floor with an almost silent splash. It was crying. The stone was crying. Tears were falling from its covered eyes. A wave of pure terror, unlike anything I had ever felt, washed over me. This wasn't just a statue that moved. This was something that was alive in a way I couldn't understand. It was grieving. It was in pain. And I was trapped in the room with it. The rule wasn't just a warning. It was a boundary. Don't turn your back on it. Don't disrespect its sorrow. I didn't need any more convincing. I stumbled backwards, my eyes wide, never once looking away from the weeping marble. I fumbled behind me for the door frame. My hand found the cool wood, and I pulled myself out of the gallery, crab walking into the relative safety of the hallway. I didn't stop until I was 20 feet away, panting, my back pressed against the opposite wall. Only then did I dare to lower my flashlight. My entire body was shaking. I looked down at my hands and they were trembling uncontrollably. 2 rules down, 3 to go, and the night was still so young. I had hours left until sunrise, hours to walk these haunted halls, following a list of impossible instructions, trying to survive whatever lived in the quiet, dark heart of the Blackwood Museum. And I had the horrible feeling that the worst was yet to come. I leaned against the wall outside the Baroque gallery, trying to catch my breath. The image of the weeping statue was burned into my mind. Real tears, from cold, dead stone. It defied every law of nature I knew. What kind of place was this? What had Arthur been dealing with for 30 years? My patrol route map was still in my pocket. I pulled it out, my hands still shaking slightly. I needed a distraction, something normal to focus on. According to the map, my next stop was the Egyptian exhibit. Rule number 3 popped into my head, clear as a warning bell. You will hear whispers coming from the Egyptian exhibit. It will sound like people calling your name. It is not people. Do not answer them. I swallowed hard. At least this rule was simple. Hear whispers, ignore them, don't answer. That seemed easier than confronting a moving statue or walking backwards out of a room. Still, the thought of hearing my own name whispered from the darkness sent a fresh wave of chills over me. The Egyptian exhibit was at the far end of the second floor. The hallway leading to it was long and narrow, lined with glass cases filled with pottery and ancient jewelry. The air grew warmer as I walked, and drier. It smelled of dust and old linen, a scent as ancient as the artifacts themselves. The entrance to the exhibit was framed by 2 towering statues of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead. Their black obsidian eyes seemed to follow me as I passed between them. In the dim light, their long snouts and pointed ears cast menacing shadows on the walls. I felt like I was crossing a threshold into another world, a world of tombs and forgotten curses. The main room was filled with artifacts, canopic jars, detailed hieroglyphs, and golden trinkets that gleamed faintly in my flashlight beam. But the main attraction, the centerpiece of the room, was a massive, ornately carved sarcophagus. It stood upright in the center of the room, its golden face staring out with blank, painted eyes. I kept my distance from it, sticking to the walls as I did my sweep. I checked the windows, barred and locked. I checked the fire extinguisher, in place. Everything seemed secure. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I hadn't heard any whispers yet. A small, foolish part of me hoped that maybe this one rule wasn't true. Maybe the whispers only happened some nights. My patrol route required me to go through this room to reach the next section, a smaller chamber dedicated to mummification tools. Just as I was about to leave the main room, I heard it. It started so faintly I thought it was the wind, or the building's ancient heating system kicking on. A soft, hissing sound, like sand being blown across a stone floor. Then, woven into that sound, was a voice. It was a dry, raspy whisper. It was impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman. The sound seemed to come from all around me, and from nowhere at all. Liu. My name. It stretched the sound out, like it was an effort to speak it. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, my hand tightening on my flashlight. The rule was clear. Do not answer. Leo, come closer. The whisper was more insistent this time. It felt like it was slithering into my ear, a cold and intimate sound. I glanced around the room, my light cutting frantically through the shadows. The room was empty, except for the sarcophagus. The sound seemed to be strongest near the golden coffin. We have secrets to tell you, Leo. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to move. I walked towards the doorway to the next room, my eyes fixed on the sarcophagus. I felt its painted gaze on my back. It felt like a physical weight. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Don't ignore us, Leo. We know you can hear us." It was hard. So hard. Every instinct was screaming at me to either yell back or run. But the note had saved me twice tonight already. I had to trust it. I put one foot in front of the other, focusing on the simple act of walking. I didn't say a word. I didn't even breathe. "Leo." The whisper became a sharp, angry hiss that echoed through the room. It felt like a slap. I flinched but kept walking. I crossed the threshold into the next room and didn't look back. The moment I was through the door, the whispers stopped. Just like that. The silence rushed back in, leaving my ears ringing. I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving. It felt like I'd been holding my breath for an hour. Whatever was in that sarcophagus, it was intelligent. It knew my name, and it did not like being ignored. The next rule on the list swam into my mind. Do not go into the sarcophagus room after 1 a.m. Close the door and lock it. I checked my watch. 12:47. I had 13 minutes. I had to finish my patrol of this wing and get back to that door before 1 o'clock. A new sense of urgency spurred me on. The rest of the Egyptian wing was just as creepy, but mercifully silent. I rushed through the remaining rooms, my flashlight beam jumping from one artifact to the next. I barely registered what I was seeing. My mind was on the clock. Every tick felt like a drumbeat counting down to some unknown disaster. I finished the wing and hurried back down the long, narrow hallway. The two Anubis statues at the entrance seemed to snarl at me as I passed. I reached the main sarcophagus room. It was now 12:58, 2 minutes to spare. The room was silent. The heavy, ornate door was wide open. It was made of solid oak with iron bands, and it looked incredibly heavy. There was a large, old-fashioned bolt lock on the outside. I didn't want to go back in there, not even for a second, but I had to close the door. I took a deep breath, held it, and darted into the room. I grabbed the thick iron handle on the door and pulled. It was even heavier than it looked. It groaned in protest, scraping loudly against the stone floor. As the door began to swing shut, I heard the whispers again, frantic this time. "No, don't close it. Leo, wait." I ignored them, putting my shoulder into the door and pushing with all my might. The gap narrowed. The darkness inside the room grew thicker. "We can help you, Leo. We can tell you what the others do." The offer was tempting, so tempting, to understand what was happening in this place, but it was a trick. The note said so. It wasn't people. It was something else, something ancient and trapped. The door was almost closed. Just a sliver of light from my flashlight remained. A final, desperate whisper hissed from the crack. "You will die in here, just like the others." With a final, desperate shove, I slammed the heavy door shut. The sound boomed through the hall like a cannon shot. The whispers were cut off instantly. I fumbled with the heavy iron bolt, my hands slick with sweat. I slid it into place with a loud, satisfying clang. It was done. The door was locked. I stood there for a moment, my ear pressed against the cold wood. I couldn't hear a thing. Whatever was in there was trapped, at least for tonight. I checked my watch. 1:02 a.m. I let out a breath. I didn't realize I had been holding. The feeling of relief was so overwhelming my knees felt weak again. I had followed the rule, and I was safe. But the final words of the whisper echoed in my mind. "You will die in here, just like the others." The others. Other guards. How many had there been? How many had failed to follow the rules? How many thought the note was a joke and walked into that room after 1 a.m.? The thought made my stomach churn. I still had one more floor to patrol. the third floor, and 2 rules left to follow: the child's cry and the gargoyle named Atticus. I was dreading them both, but I had no choice. The sun was still hours away. I had to keep moving. I had to see this night through to the end. I turned away from the sealed Egyptian exhibit and headed for the stairs, my heavy boots echoing in the haunted silence of the museum. The night was far from over. The third floor was different. The air up here was thin and stale, thick with the smell of aging paper and drying paint. This was where the museum stored its less famous, but no less creepy collections. There were entire wings dedicated to medieval armor, antique dolls, and grim-looking surgical tools from centuries past. It was a floor of forgotten things. My footsteps were softer here. The marble of the lower floors gave way to dark, old-growth wood that seemed to absorb the sound. The silence was heavier, more watchful. My patrol route took me first towards the Renaissance wing, a place I now dreaded with every fiber of my being. Rule number 4. Sometimes you will hear what sounds like a child crying near the Renaissance wing. It is a lure. It's not a child. No matter how real it sounds, do not go looking for the source. A lure. That one word scared me more than anything else. It implied a trap. It implied a hunter. Something in this museum wasn't just waiting, it was actively trying to draw you in. The Renaissance wing was at the end of a long, wide corridor. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced noblemen and their pale, somber wives. Their eyes, dark and flat in the flashlight beam, seemed to hold a shared, secret disapproval. They had watched generations of guards walk this hall. They knew how the story ended. I walked slowly, my senses on high alert. I was listening for the faintest sound, the smallest hint of a cry. The corridor was eerily quiet. All I could hear was the soft scuff of my shoes on the wood and the frantic thumping of my own heart. Maybe this was another sometimes rule. Maybe tonight I'd be lucky. Maybe the crying child wouldn't make an appearance. I reached the entrance to the wing. It was a large, open archway. Inside, I could see the outlines of ornate furniture and large, dark canvases. I paused, listening. Nothing. I let out a slow, quiet breath of relief. I had to sweep the wing, check the fire exits, and move on. The sooner I was out of this area, the better. I stepped through the archway, my light dancing across. The room. And that's when I heard it. It was a faint, pathetic sound. A soft little whimper, like a child who had just woken up from a bad dream. It was so quiet, so full of misery, that my heart clenched. It sounded like it was coming from just around the corner, deeper in the wing. My training, my instincts, every decent part of me screamed to go and find that child, to help them, to comfort them. How could a kid be in the museum at this hour? Were they trapped? Hurt? But the note. It is a lure. It's not a child. I stood frozen, caught between my gut reaction and the stark, life-saving warning on that piece of paper. The whimpering continued, getting a little louder. It was the sound of pure, helpless sorrow. Then it turned into a word. Mama? The voice was small, trembling, and utterly convincing. It was the voice of a little girl, no older than 5 or 6. My stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't a vague whisper from a tomb. This was a child, asking for her mother in the dark. Mama, I'm scared. I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw ached. My hand was shaking, the beam of my flashlight trembling on the wall. This was a test. It had to be. Whatever was making that sound, it knew exactly how to pull at a person's heartstrings. It was using my own humanity against me. I forced myself to turn away from the sound. I began my patrol, my movements stiff and robotic. I walked the perimeter of the room, checking the windows, my eyes darting into the shadows. The crying followed me, seeming to echo from the very walls around me. "Please, is anyone there? I'm lost." It sounded so real, so agonizingly real. I could picture a little girl with big, tear-filled eyes huddled in a corner, terrified. The image was so strong it was almost a hallucination. Was Arthur sure about this one? What if he was wrong? What if this was the one time it really was a child? What if I ignored her, and in the morning they found... No, I couldn't think like that. I had to trust the rules. They had kept me alive so far. The bronze soldier, the weeping marquis, the whispers. They were all real. This had to be real too. I finished my sweep of the first room and moved to the next. The crying got louder, closer. It was as if the source was just on the other side of the wall. "Help me! Please, somebody help me!" The voice was no longer just sad. It was terrified. It was a full-blown, panicked shriek. My resolve wavered. A cold sweat beaded on my forehead. My mind was screaming, "This is wrong. You have to help her." I stopped, my hand on the doorframe of the next gallery. I was fighting a war inside my own head. The rational part of me clung to the note, to the impossible things I had already seen. But the emotional part, the human part, was being torn to shreds by the sound of that child's terror. Suddenly, the crying stopped. The abrupt silence was more shocking than the noise. 1 second, the air was filled with desperate screams. The next, absolute quiet. I stood perfectly still, listening. Why had it stopped? And then a new sound began. It was a low chuckle. It was a deep, guttural sound, filled with a cold, ancient amusement. It was not a child's laugh. It was something old and predatory, and it was coming from the exact same spot the crying had been. The blood in my veins turned to ice. The chuckle grew into a low, rumbling laugh. It was a sound of pure malice, the sound of a predator that has successfully toyed with its prey. It knew I had heard. It knew I had been tempted, and it was laughing at my fear. It is a lure. Now I understood. The crying wasn't the lure itself. The lure was my own compassion. The trap was my own decency. It wasn't trying to trick my ears. It was trying to trick my heart. The laughter continued for a few more seconds, a horrible, grating sound that vibrated in my chest. Then, it too faded away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier and more threatening than before. I didn't finish my patrol of the Renaissance wing. I didn't care what the map said. I backed away, my eyes wide, searching the shadows for the source of that terrible sound. I backed out of the wing, down the long corridor, past the disapproving eyes of the painted nobles, and didn't stop until I reached the main staircase. I leaned on the banister, my breath coming in ragged gasps. That was the closest I had come to breaking a rule, the closest I had come to falling into the trap. If that laughter hadn't started, would I have gone looking? The thought terrified me. I had one rule left. Rule number 5. The gargoyle, Atticus. Before you pass the rooftop access door on the 3rd floor, check the gargoyle statue next to it. Its name is Atticus. Leave him a small polished stone. A pebble from the courtyard will do. He guards the building. Keep him happy. I didn't have a pebble from the courtyard. I hadn't even thought about it until now. Panic flared in my chest. What was I going to do? I couldn't go all the way outside and back up. I frantically searched my pockets. Keys, wallet, the note, lint, and something small and hard. I pulled it out. It was a small, smooth gray stone. I'd picked it up from the riverbank last weekend while skipping rocks with my nephew. I'd put it in my pocket because I liked the feel of it, and then forgotten all about it. It was perfectly polished by the water, cool and solid in my hand. Relief, so powerful it almost made me dizzy, washed over me. I had a stone. The rooftop access door was in a small, forgotten alcove at the very back of the 3rd floor. I had to pass through the hall of antique dolls to get there. Hundreds of tiny glass eyes watched me from behind display cases. Their painted smiles seemed to widen as I passed. In any other circumstance, this would have been the creepiest part of my night. Now, it was just a mild inconvenience. I found the door. It was a heavy steel thing with a single barred window, and next to it, crouched on a stone pedestal, was Atticus. He was a grotesque masterpiece of carved granite. He had the body of a lion, the wings of a bat, and a snarling, almost human face. He was hunched over, his stone claws gripping the edge of the pedestal, his mouth open in a silent roar. He was designed to ward off evil spirits. Tonight, I felt like I was surrounded by them. He guards the building. Keep him happy. With a deep sense of the surreal, I stepped forward. My footsteps echoed in the small alcove. I stood before the gargoyle. He was cold, solid stone, just like all the others, but I knew better now. I placed the small, smooth river stone on the pedestal, right in front of his massive, clawed feet. "For you," I whispered, feeling like a complete idiot, "to, keep you happy." For a moment, nothing happened. The gargoyle remained a statue, a grim and silent sentinel. I started to turn away, feeling foolish. Then I heard a deep, scraping rumble. It sounded like rocks grinding together deep underground. I whipped my head back around, my flashlight beam finding the statue again, and I saw its head move. Slowly, with the sound of immense friction, the gargoyle's stone head turned. Its granite neck groaned in protest. It lowered its gaze from the hallway to the small pebble resting at its feet. Then its stony jaw shifted. The snarling mouth, frozen open for centuries, slowly, impossibly, closed. The silent roar was over. It wasn't a smile, it wasn't a pleasant look, but it was a look of satisfaction, of acknowledgement. A low, deep purr, like the sound of a giant cat, rumbled from the gargoyle's chest. The sound vibrated through the floor. Atticus was happy. He had accepted my offering. Then, just as slowly, his head turned back to its original position, his gaze once again fixed on the empty hallway. His mouth remained closed. He was still. I had passed the final test. I had followed all 5 rules. I backed away from the alcove, a strange mix of terror and awe washing over me. I had survived. I had made it through the night's trials. The worst was over. Or so I thought. I glanced at my watch. It was 3:30 a.m. Sunrise was still hours away, and I had a horrible, sinking feeling that the rules weren't just for my patrol. They were for the entire night, and the museum was not done with me yet. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion settled over me. Adrenaline had kept me going for hours, but now that I had completed my patrol and followed all the rules, the fatigue hit me like a physical blow. My muscles ached, and my mind felt fuzzy and slow. All I wanted was to go back to the security office, lock the door, and ride out the rest of the night in front of the monitors. I made my way back down the creaking wooden stairs, my flashlight beam bouncing weakly. The museum felt different now. Before, it had been a place of unknown threats, a haunted house of jump scares and creepy sounds, but now I felt like I understood it. Just little. It wasn't random chaos. It was a system, a world with its own strange, secret logic. The note was the key to navigating it. I reached the ground floor and headed back towards the security office. The path took me through the edge of the grand hall. I cast a wary glance at the bronze soldier. He stood exactly where he should be, pointing north, a silent, metallic guardian. He hadn't moved again. It was a small comfort, but I took it. The security office felt like a sanctuary. I stepped inside, the familiar sight of the blinking monitors and worn-out office chair a welcome relief. I closed the door and locked it, the click of the bolt echoing in the quiet room. For the first time all night, I felt a sliver of safety. I sank into the chair, letting out a long, slow breath. The chair squeaked in protest. On the main monitor, a grid of 16 black and white images showed me the museum's empty halls. I could see the Baroque gallery, the entrance to the Egyptian exhibit, the grand hall. All of them were still, silent, and empty. From here, you'd never know anything was wrong. You'd never guess that the things in those rooms were alive. I stared at the screen showing the Baroque gallery. The weeping Marquise stood in the center of the room, her face in her hands. She was just a blurry, gray figure on the low-resolution camera. From this distance, I couldn't see if she was still crying. I didn't want to know. I spent the next hour just watching the screens, my eyes scanning from one to the next. It was hypnotic. The empty hallways, the silent galleries, the deep pools of shadow. Nothing moved. Nothing happened. The museum was holding its breath. Slowly, a dangerous thought began to creep into my mind. Maybe the rules only applied when I was out there, walking among them. Maybe they only reacted to my presence. If I stayed in here, locked away, maybe they would all just stay still. Maybe I could just wait out the rest of the night right here. It was a tempting idea. It felt safe. My eyes were getting heavy. The low hum of the computer equipment was a soothing, monotonous drone. My head nodded once, then twice. I was drifting off, the exhaustion finally winning the battle. I propped my elbows on the desk and rested my head in my hands, my gaze still fixed loosely on the monitors. A sudden flash of movement on one of the screens snapped me back to full alertness. My head shot up. I blinked, my heart suddenly racing again. Which screen was it? I scanned the grid, my eyes wide. There, camera 7, the Hall of Ancient Greece. The Hall of Ancient Greece was filled with dozens of statues, gods, goddesses, athletes, and philosophers, all carved from pristine white marble. They were arranged on pedestals in lifelike poses. On the monitor, they were an army of pale, silent figures, but one of them was in the wrong place. In the back of the hall stood a statue known as the Discus Thrower. It was a famous piece, a muscular athlete captured, mid-throw, his body twisted in a coil of potential energy, his arm swung back, a marble discus in his hand. He was supposed to be on a pedestal at the far right of the room. He wasn't. He was now in the center of the aisle. He had stepped off his pedestal. I stared at the screen, my mouth dry. I hadn't been in that hall. My patrol route didn't cover it. There was no rule for the discus thrower. The note hadn't mentioned anything on the first floor besides the bronze soldier. As I watched, paralyzed, the statue moved again. It didn't happen in a blink. On the grainy camera feed, it was a slow, deliberate motion. His head, which should have been looking back over his shoulder, turned. It rotated on his marble neck with a stiff, unnatural smoothness. He was now looking directly at the security camera. A cold, visceral fear, unlike anything I had felt before, gripped me. The other encounters had been strange, terrifying, but they felt contained. They were part of a system. This was different. This was a deviation. This was something new. The statue wasn't just moving, it was aware. It knew I was watching. Then he began to walk. It was a horrible, lumbering gait. He dragged his marble feet across the floor, the sound of which I couldn't hear through the silent monitor, but I could imagine it perfectly. A heavy, grating scrape of stone on stone. He walked with the stiff, unbending purpose of something that was not meant to move. He was walking out of the hall of ancient Greece. He was heading for the main corridor, the corridor that led directly to the security office. Panic, pure, undiluted panic seized me. I scrambled for the note, my hands trembling so badly I almost tore the fragile paper. I read it again and again, my eyes flying over the 5 rules. There was nothing about a walking discus thrower, nothing about what to do if one of them came for you. The note was a survival guide, but it wasn't a complete one. It only covered the scheduled events, the predictable dangers. This was something else. This was an outlier. This was an active threat. On the monitors, I watched his progress. He moved from camera to camera, out of the Hall of Greece, camera 7, into the main rotunda, camera 5, and now he was turning down the service corridor, camera 3. He moved with a relentless, unstoppable pace. Each heavy step brought him closer. I was trapped. The office had one door. He was coming down the only hallway that led to it. My sanctuary was about to become my tomb. My mind raced, desperately searching for a solution. I looked around the office, desk, chair, computer, a heavy-duty mag light. Nothing that could stop a 2-ton statue of solid marble. My eyes fell on the control panel for the museum's security shutters. They were heavy, steel curtains that could be lowered over the main entrances and certain sensitive exhibits in case of a riot or emergency. I had been shown how to use them during my orientation. Could they work? The doorway to the office didn't have one, but the hallway did. There was an emergency shutter about 20 feet down the corridor, right before the turn that led to my office. If I could get that down in time, it might block his path. It might trap him. It was my only chance. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering like a drum. I could hear him now, a faint, rhythmic scraping sound from down the hall. Scrape, scrape, scrape. He was getting closer. I unlocked the office door, my hand slick with sweat. I peeked out. The hallway was dark, but I could see his silhouette at the far end, a hulking shape of white against the blackness. He was moving slowly, but he was moving. The shutter control was a red button under a glass case on the wall opposite my door. I had to go out into the hall to press it. I didn't let myself think. I just acted. I threw the door open and lunged for the button. I flipped up the plastic cover and slammed my palm down on the red button. A loud alarm bell started to ring, its shrill cry echoing through the museum. Above me, I heard the grinding of gears. The heavy steel shutter began to descend from the ceiling. It was slow, agonizingly slow. The discus thrower saw it, and he saw me. He picked up his pace. His lumbering walk turned into a thundering, crashing run. The scraping sound became a series of deafening booms as his marble feet slammed against the floor. He was going to make it. He was too fast. The shutter was too slow. I was frozen in the doorway, watching the nightmare unfold. The gap under the shutter was shrinking. 10 feet, 8 feet, 6. The statue was charging, his marble arms still cocked back, ready to throw. His blank eyes were fixed on me. 5 feet, 4. He lowered his shoulder like a linebacker and charged for the gap. With a final, deafening boom, the steel shutter slammed into the floor. It was a split second too late. He was through. He was on my side of the gate, trapped in the small section of hallway with me in my office. The alarm bell was still ringing, a frantic soundtrack to my impending death. He stood there for a moment, his massive form filling the corridor. Then he turned his head and looked at me. He took a heavy step forward, and another. I scrambled back into the office and slammed the door, fumbling with the lock. It clicked into place just as the statue's massive marble fist smashed into the wood. The door shuddered, the frame cracking under the impact. He hit it again. Boom! Wood splintered. The doorknob rattled violently. This door wouldn't hold. Not for long. I was out of options. I was trapped. The last whisper from the sarcophagus echoed in my head. You will die in here, just like the others. Another thunderous crash against the door. This time, a long crack appeared in the wood, running from top to bottom. I could see the grayish-white of the marble through the splintered gap. He was looking in. I stumbled backwards, pressing myself against the bank of monitors, my eyes wide with terror. The door wouldn't last another minute. I was a rat in a trap, and the walls were closing in. My mind, frantic and desperate, raced through every action movie, every survival show I'd ever seen. There had to be something, some trick, some way out. My eyes darted around the small office, searching for a weapon, an escape route, anything. But there was nothing, just office equipment and the cold, unblinking eyes of the security cameras on the screen. The cameras. My gaze locked onto the monitor grid. All 16 screens showed a different part of the museum, a different part of this living, breathing ecosystem of stone and shadow. I had been so focused on the one threat outside my door that I had forgotten about all the others. The weeping Marquis, the bronze soldier, the sarcophagus, Atticus. They weren't just individual dangers. They were part of a world, and every world has rules. Not just the 5 on my list. There had to be more. An internal logic, a cause and effect. What had I done to make the discus thrower come after me? I hadn't even been in his wing. I stared at the monitor for camera 7, showing the now empty pedestal in the Hall of Ancient Greece. Why him? Why not one of the others? The statue was an athlete, a figure of action, of movement. The bronze soldier was a sentry, bound to his post. The Marquis was a creature of sorrow, rooted in her grief. The whispers were trapped. Atticus was a guardian. Each had a role, a purpose. The discus thrower's purpose was to throw. He was a statue defined by an action he could never complete. An eternity of coiled potential, of muscles tensed to unleash a power that never came. Maybe he wasn't angry at me. Maybe he was just active, unbound, a free radical in a system of otherwise stable elements. Another bone-jarring slam on the door. A hinge tore loose with a sharp shriek of protesting metal. The door sagged inwards, held only by the lock and the one remaining hinge. I didn't have much time. An idea, born of sheer desperation, sparked in my mind. It was insane. It was a wild gamble based on nothing but a hunch. But it was the only idea I had. I looked at the monitors again, my eyes scanning the museum layout. The grand hall, camera 2. The bronze soldier stood there, facing north. Silent, still. According to the rule, he only moved if he was facing the wrong way. But what was his purpose? He was a soldier, a warrior, a legionary. What if I could point the discus thrower at something else? What if I could give him a new target? It was a crazy long shot, but doing nothing was a guarantee of death. I scrambled over to the museum's PA system, a small microphone and a panel of buttons on a console in the corner. I had used it during training to make a test announcement. The museum will be closing in 15 minutes. It felt like a lifetime ago. I flicked the switch to on. My hand trembled as I keyed the microphone for the grand hall. I had to choose my words carefully. I had to do something that would get the soldiers' attention. Another splintering crash. The door was barely hanging on. The statue's marble fingers curled through one of the holes, blindly searching. I took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone, my voice a shaky, desperate whisper that was broadcast as a booming command into the cavernous grand hall. Bronze soldier. An enemy has breached the perimeter. Hostile force detected in the West Service Corridor. I repeat, hostile force in the West Corridor. I let go of the button, my heart pounding in my ears. I stared at camera 2, the monitor showing the grand hall. For a second, nothing happened. The soldier remained motionless, a statue of bronze obedience. My heart sank. It was a stupid idea. I was just a fool shouting at the darkness. But then, it moved, not like before, not the slow, grinding turn. This was different. His head snapped to the west towards the direction of my office, with a speed that should have been impossible for something so large and heavy. It was a sharp, alert military movement. He lifted his outstretched arm, the one that had always pointed north. The arm bent, and his hand rested on the hilt of the bronze gladius, the short sword that hung at his hip. And then he stepped off his pedestal. The impact when his bronze feet hit the marble floor shook the camera. He didn't walk or lumber. He moved with a frightening, disciplined purpose, a heavy, rhythmic, marching tread that I could now hear faintly through the walls. Boom, boom, boom. He was a predator, and he was hunting. He was coming. A final, devastating blow shattered the office door. It flew off its last hinge and crashed to the floor, revealing the hulking form of the discus thrower. He filled the doorway, his white marble body seeming to glow in the dim light. He took a step into the office, his head tilted as if curious, his blank eyes fixed on me. This was it. I was out of time. I scrambled backwards, knocking over the office chair. There was nowhere left to run. I was cornered. He raised his arm, the one holding the discus. He was finally going to complete his throw. The target was me. But then he paused. His head tilted, listening. The sound was getting louder. The heavy, metallic footsteps were drawing closer. Boom, boom, boom. It was the sound of approaching thunder, the sound of doom. The discus thrower turned his head, his attention shifting from me to the sound coming from the hallway. For the first time, an expression seemed to cross his blank features. It wasn't fear. It was recognition, a challenge. He turned his body, positioning himself to face the hallway. He was no longer interested in me. A greater threat, or perhaps a worthy opponent, had appeared. I held my breath, watching the scene unfold from my corner of the room. The discus thrower stood his ground as the bronze soldier marched into view. The soldier was a terrifying sight. His bronze skin seemed to absorb the light, making him a figure of pure shadow and menace. His hand was still on his sword. He stopped about 10 feet from the discus thrower. The two statues faced each other in the narrow corridor. The warrior and the athlete, bronze versus marble, an ancient legionary against a classical champion. For a long moment, they were both perfectly still, two impossible titans locked in a silent standoff. The only sound was the incessant, panicked ringing of the security alarm. Then, the bronze soldier drew his sword. The sound of the bronze blade scraping against its bronze sheath was a piercing shriek of metal. He raised the sword, its polished surface catching the dim light. The discus thrower responded. He began to spin, just like the classic statues depict. He spun once, twice, a blur of white marble and coiled muscle. He was building momentum, preparing to unleash a throw with the force of a catapult. I covered my head with my arms and pressed myself as flat against the wall as I could. The hallway was about to become a battleground. The soldier charged. His heavy bronze feet pounded against the floor, each step cracking the marble tiles. He moved with the brutal efficiency of a trained killer. At the same time, the discus thrower let his weapon fly. The marble discus shot from his hand with an explosive sound like a cannon firing. It wasn't a graceful, soaring disc. It was a spinning projectile of solid stone, a deadly white blur. The soldier, incredibly, reacted. He brought up his sword and deflected the discus. The sound of marble hitting bronze was a deafening clang that echoed through the museum like a church bell. The discus ricocheted, shattering a glass display case on the wall. It spun across the floor and came to a rest by my feet. But the deflection had cost the soldier his momentum. The discus thrower, his throw complete, lunged forward, tackling the soldier with the full force of his marble body. The two collided with a sound like a landslide. They crashed against the wall, shaking the entire building. The soldier, despite being made of metal, was knocked off balance. They grappled, a writhing mass of stone and bronze. The soldier stabbed downwards with his sword, but the discus thrower caught his arm, his marble fingers gripping the soldier's bronze wrist. It was a stalemate, a battle of gods or monsters happening 10 feet from my hiding spot. I could only watch in stunned, horrified silence. I had unleashed this. I had pitted one monster against another in a desperate bid to survive. And now, I had no idea how it would end, or what would happen to me when it was over. The battle in the hallway was brutal and slow. It wasn't a flurry of quick strikes, but a grinding contest of immense force. The soldier, with his weapon and training, pushed forward, trying to bring the point of his sword to bear. The discus thrower, with his raw athletic power, resisted, his marble muscles straining against the bronze. The sound was a continuous groan of scraping stone and screeching metal. Cracks spiderwebbed across the marble floor tiles under their immense weight. I was trapped, a spectator to a war I had started. I couldn't go into the hallway, and I couldn't stay in the destroyed office forever. My gamble had saved me from the immediate threat, but it had created a new, chaotic one. What would the winner do when the fight was over? Would it turn its attention back to me? The fight shifted. The bronze soldier, using his superior leverage, managed to twist his body, forcing the discus thrower against the steel security shutter. The metal door buckled inwards with a deafening boom. The soldier pressed his advantage, pinning the marble athlete against the bent steel. He raised his sword high for a final, decisive blow. But the discus thrower was not finished. With a surge of desperate strength, he shoved the soldier back. The sudden movement gave him just enough space. He didn't have a weapon, so he became one. He lowered his head and charged, slamming his solid marble shoulder into the soldier's midsection. The impact was catastrophic. There was a sickening crunching sound. The soldier's bronze torso, which I had assumed was solid, dented inward. He staggered back, his bronze form bent at an unnatural angle. His grip on his sword loosened. The discus thrower pressed on, delivering a series of powerful blows with his fists, each one landing with the force of a sledgehammer. More dents appeared on the soldier's body and helmet. He was being beaten, battered into scrap metal. The soldier stumbled, his movements becoming slow and clumsy. He dropped his sword. It clattered loudly on the floor. He was defeated. He stood there for a moment, his head bowed, his body broken. The discus thrower paused, his fists raised. He looked down at his vanquished opponent. Then he did something I didn't expect. He didn't deliver a final blow. He simply turned and walked away. His purpose, it seemed, was not to destroy, but simply to win. He lumbered back down the corridor, his heavy footsteps echoing, leaving the broken soldier in his wake. I watched on the monitor as he returned to the Hall of Ancient Greece, stepped back onto his pedestal, and resumed his classic coiled pose, as if nothing had ever happened. In the hallway outside my office, the bronze soldier stood motionless. He was a wreck. His helmet was askew, his body was caved in, and his proud posture was gone. He looked like what he was, a relic of a forgotten war, finally and truly defeated. The immediate danger was over, but the museum was in chaos. The alarm was still blaring, the hallway was destroyed, and a valuable statue was ruined. I was going to be fired. That was the best-case scenario. The worst-case scenario was being thrown in a padded room. Who would ever believe my story? Slowly, cautiously, I crept out of the office. I stepped over the wreckage of my door, my eyes fixed on the broken soldier. He didn't move. He was still, inert. I bent down and picked up his bronze sword. It was heavier than I could have imagined, the grip worn smooth from centuries of use. What now? The sun would be up in a couple of hours. The morning staff would arrive. They would find this mess. My night of surreal horror would come crashing into the real world. I looked at the crumpled note still clutched in my hand. The 5 rules had guided me through the scheduled horrors, but the 6th, unwritten rule was the most important one. The museum is an ecosystem, and I had just thrown it completely out of balance. I had to fix it. I had to at least try. I knew what I had to do. The rule for the soldier was specific. Whisper, the war is over. Go back to your post. His war was now truly over. He had lost, but he wasn't at his post. Holding the heavy bronze sword, I walked up to the battered statue. I stood before him, this broken warrior. His empty eye sockets seemed to stare at the floor in shame. I leaned in close, my voice a quiet whisper, just as the note instructed. The war is over, I said, my voice filled with a strange, unexpected pity. Go back to your post. For a long moment, nothing. I thought perhaps he was too damaged to respond. But then, with a low groan of tortured metal, he began to move. He straightened his dented body, his movements slow and painful. He turned, and with a heavy, dragging limp, he began to make his way back towards the grand hall. He left a long scrape in the marble floor with every step. I watched him go, then my eyes fell on the sword in my hand. He had dropped his weapon. He couldn't go back to his post without it. I had to return it. I followed him at a distance, down the corridor and into the vast, dark space of the grand hall. He limped to his pedestal and, with a great effort, hoisted himself back up onto it. He turned to face north, but he looked incomplete. His hand was empty. I walked to the base of the pedestal. "You forgot this," I said softly. I didn't know how I was going to get the heavy sword up to him. But as I stood there, he slowly lowered his arm. His bronze fingers opened, waiting. I raised the sword, and he took it from me. His grip was surprisingly gentle. He raised the sword, and with a smooth, practiced motion, slid it back into its sheath at his side. His arm then returned to its familiar, outstretched pose, pointing north. He was whole again. And then, the most impossible thing of the entire night happened. The dents in his bronze armor began to smooth out. The caved-in torso reformed. The twisted helmet straightened. In a matter of seconds, he was pristine again, as if the fight had never happened. The museum was healing itself, restoring the balance. I looked down at the floor. The cracks in the marble were gone. Back in the service corridor, I knew the shutter would be fixed, the display case repaired. By morning, there would be no evidence, no proof. It would be as if it was all a dream. Except for me. I had seen it. I knew the truth. I spent the rest of the night in the security office, watching the monitors. The museum was quiet. Everything was in its place. The discus thrower was on his pedestal. The bronze soldier was at his post. The weeping Marquess was still weeping, but I understood her sorrow a little better now. She was crying for all the broken, beautiful, and dangerous things trapped in this place. When the first rays of dawn touched the high windows of the grand hall, it felt like waking from a long, terrible fever. The sunlight, pale and gray at first, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It chased the deepest shadows from the corners and promised the return of the normal world. The night was over. I had survived. When my replacement, a cheerful day guard named Dave, arrived, he found me sitting at the desk staring blankly at the monitors. "Rough first night, Leo?" he asked, clapping me on the shoulder. "Place can be a little spooky when it's empty." I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "You have no idea," I managed to croak out. I gathered my things, my movements slow and deliberate. As I was about to leave, I saw a piece of yellowed paper on the floor. The note. I had dropped it. I picked it up and was about to throw it away. But I stopped. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my wallet. It was more valuable than any amount of money. I walked out of the museum into the bright morning light. The city was waking up. Cars were humming on the streets. Everything was normal. No one knew what happened in the Blackwood Museum when the doors were locked and the lights went out. No one knew about the secrets that slept in the stone and the bronze. But I knew, and I knew I'd be back tonight. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was my duty. I was the guardian. I was the one who knew the rules, and I was the only thing standing between this secret world and the one outside. Thank you so much for watching. This story was a wild one to put together, and if you made it to the end, you are an absolute legend. Let me know in the comments which rule you thought was the creepiest, or what you would have done if you were in my shoes. Your support is the reason we can keep telling these stories. We'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.